China warns the U.S. that any agreements on trade will be obliterated if America presses ahead with tariffs. U.S. Defense Secretary says nuclear talks with North Korea will be bumpy. And Hong Kong students can look forward to smoother UK visa applications this year.
Good evening and welcome. China has warned the United States that any agreements reached on trade and business will be void if Washington pulls the trigger on threatened tariff hikes on Chinese goods. The warning came after high-level economic talks between the two sides wrapped up in Beijing. U.S. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross arrived in Beijing for talks after the Trump administration renewed tariff threats against China. A short statement carried by the state-run Xinhua News Agency made no mention of any specific new agreements, but said both sides had good communication in areas such as agriculture and energy and made concrete progress. Ross said the tone of the interactions was friendly and frank. No joint statement was issued and neither side released details. At a G7 meeting in Canada, the U.S. Treasury Secretary said Ross didn't just head to Beijing to discuss the $375 billion U.S. dollar trade deficit with China.
We're also focused on structural changes. We had productive discussions with the Vice Premier. Previous meetings, we got a lot more work to do. So, I want to be clear, this isn't just about buying more goods.
The U.S. and China have threatened tit-for-tat tariffs on goods worth up to $150 billion U.S. dollars each. Xinhua said today that if the U.S. introduces trade sanctions, including tariffs, all the economic and trade achievements negotiated by the two parties will be void. The China talks were said to cover other issues, including the Trump administration's desire to eliminate Chinese joint venture requirements and other policies that effectively force technology transfers. Aside from tackling the trade deficit, the U.S. team also wanted to secure greater intellectual property protection and end Chinese subsidies that have contributed to overproduction of steel and aluminum. At the G7 Summit of Industrialized Nations in Whistler, B.C., finance ministers have been sounding off against the tariff offensive by the United States, and the U.S. Trade Secretary failed to soothe fears of a looming trade war.
The Americans have decided to, in our mind, take an action that's not at all constructive. It's actually destructive to our ability to get things done. In Canada, we've been clear. We think this action is inappropriate. We think it's absurd to consider Canada a security risk to the United States, and therefore we've taken a targeted and considered approach to retaliation.
This issue will obviously come up at the leaders' session next week, and the leaders will talk about it. And again, our objective is to make sure we have fair and balanced trade, and that's really what we're focused on.
Finance ministers are hoping the threat of retaliation against the U.S. trade measures will persuade the Trump administration to back away from the steel and aluminum tariffs it has imposed on its G7 allies. Frustrations have set the stage for a tense G7 leaders summit next week in Quebec.
Expect a bumpy road to the nuclear negotiations with North Korea. That today from the U.S. Defense Secretary, who's warning South Korea and Japan to maintain a defensive stance.
We welcome the Panmunjom Declaration for Peace, Prosperity, and Unification of the Korean Peninsula that was announced in April. We can anticipate at best a bumpy road to the negotiation. As defense ministers, we must maintain a strong, collaborative defensive stance so we enable our diplomats to negotiate from a calm position of strength in this critical time. Especially now, we must remain vigilant, and we will continue to implement all UN Security Council resolutions on North Korea.
Jim Mattis was speaking on the final day of the Shangri-La Dialogue Security Conference in Singapore. That's where South Korea's defense minister vowed to keep up the pressure on North Korea. In fact, Song Young-moo said given Pyongyang's past behavior, South Korea is only cautiously optimistic the North will dismantle its nuclear program. Japan's defense minister also agreed cooperation between their defense forces is key. Itsunori Onodera strongly believes adhering to their trilateral agreement will help to make the Trump-Kim summit a success. Other issues were addressed at the International Security Conference in Singapore. Defense ministers of Qatar and the Philippines discussed the rise in terror attacks and how to combat it.
Numerous components contributed to the creation of an enemy, feeling of alienation, economic disparities, social inequality, and political exclusion have all proven to be leading drivers in the recruitment of terrorists and the increase of terrorist attacks.
The digital revolution, which enables instantaneous communication in a highly unregulated and borderless domain, has given terrorist groups as well as lone actors a covert, efficient, and practically cost-free means to reach a wider audience.
As for Germany's defense minister, she insists her government's ultimate goal is to have an army of Europeans by joining forces with allies.
Only if we join forces will Europe become a more relevant global partner, a more relevant partner also for our friends here in Asia.
Well, here in Hong Kong, students may find things a bit smoother when they apply for their UK visas this year. This after British authorities promised to improve procedures. Hundreds of students were left in limbo last year because of delays in visa processing. Christy Leung has the story.
It is June, the time when students who want to study abroad start preparing their visa applications. However, those who wish to study in the UK may want to reserve extra time to have their applications processed. That is because hundreds of Hong Kong students were left hanging last year due to the unexpected delays in getting their visas processed. Education sector lawmaker Ip Kin Yuen said last year he had more than 1,100 cases of students seeking help. He added that most students were able to get their visas just in time. However, there was one student whose admission was cancelled because of the visa delay. He later received a conditional offer from his college. After meeting with British immigration officials in March, Ip said they have pledged to improve their procedures. This includes a new system for applicants to submit their documents online, as well as allocating more staff to deal with the applications.
It shows that they are responsible and they are taking up the issue very seriously. And so they made their promise. I hope that eventually they would improve the technology they use. They will put up sufficient manpower to deal with all the issues.
Ip was told that the delay was caused by lack of manpower as well as technical issues of a scanning system which was used to record applicants' data.
Ip also reminded students to apply for their visas once their admissions are confirmed, as July to August is usually the peak period for applications. Christy Leung, TVB News.
The government may require extra checkups on aging lifts after a series of recent accidents. In the long run, it wants to install safety devices on all elevators. But as Caleb Leung reports, some homeowners worry it will cost them and want the government to pay instead.
At least 2 serious lift accidents have happened this year, including a fatal one in Shengshui last month. Speaking to TVB News, Alfred Sitt, the director of Electrical and Mechanical Services, said the lifts involved did not have the latest safety devices. The same goes for the around 50,000 of the city's roughly 66,000 lifts, as they were installed before stricter laws were in place. Sitt believes the situation has to change.
We are thinking whether we should ask the contractors and also the owner of the lift to add some more protective device so that they can more up to the international standard.
The department is thinking about making the upgrades mandatory, but Sid said the government is still discussing financial help for homeowners who require lift upgrades. As for the short run, his department may require older lifts to undergo more frequent checkups. Maintenance fees per lift may increase by several $1,000s under this measure, but Sid said it's totally worth it. However, not all homeowners seem to agree. This homeowner, Mr. Hui, lives in the To Kwa Wan building with 7 lifts installed. According to Hui, maintenance cost per lift is around $30,000 annually, but more than $1 million was spent on repairs just last year alone. Increasing the maintenance frequency may only cost each household around $300 extra per month, but any problems found would cost a lot more to fix. There were plans to replace the lifts, but the homeowners couldn't reach a consensus. The reason? It costs several $1 million to replace the elevators, and not everyone wants to fork out the cash. As the lifts go out of order on a near daily basis, Mr. Hui hopes the government could subsidize them on lift replacements. Caleb Low, TVB News.
Well, the government is expecting high demand for the upcoming seasonal flu vaccine. The Secretary for Food and Health also reiterated a government line, reminding family doctors to order their shots early. Wenna Wang reports.
According to the Center for Health Protection, Hong Kong's flu season is January through March and again from July to August. In other words, the next one is right around the corner. The government expects demand for the vaccine will be even greater than last season, especially since authorities have now expanded its subsidy for seniors aged 50 to 64 too. But it's not just for older people. Speaking today, Secretary for Food and Health, Sophia Chan, called on family doctors to order everything early. In particular, doctors who will be doing the outreach program at schools, she said. We expect demand for that will reach around 300,000 shots. Earlier this year, flu outbreaks were rampant in the city's primary schools and kindergartens. Many children were admitted to hospitals for severe flu symptoms. It was bad enough that the government called an early start to the Lunar New Year holidays for these schools in an attempt to curb the spreading. Wenna Wang, TVB News.
砌模型要一步步咁去做，要確定選民資料啱唔啱，就要咁樣做。臨時選民登記冊同取消登記名單發表咗啦，請登入 www.voterinfo.gov.hk 查閱你嘅資料。有疑問要喺6月25號或之前向選舉事務處提出。
收到提示信要喺6月25號或之前回覆，先可以保留選民登記。
查詢28911001。
Back to TVB News. A taxi driver has been arrested after his vehicle slammed into a cyclist this morning. The cyclist was later confirmed dead. Kana Chu has the story.
The incident happened at around 4 a.m. along Canton Road near Austin. The taxi involved could be seen parked opposite a construction site near the Siqiu Center. The vehicle's windshield was shattered and headlight had come off after the collision. The bicycle was lying twisted on the road. The 41-year-old taxi driver was arrested for dangerous driving causing death and was detained for further inquiries. He was later released on bail but is required to report back to the police in July. The victim sustained serious head injuries after the crash and was rushed to Queen Elizabeth Hospital for treatment. He was later certified dead. Police said the taxi involved was traveling along Canton Road towards Yau Ma Tei when the accident happened. Sources indicated the cyclist was hit near Tsim Sha Tsui Fire Station when the taxi tried to cut a lane from the left. The cyclist was thrown 20 meters forward with his bike. Sources also said the bicycle didn't have safety lights. The 56-year-old victim was allegedly returning to a restaurant after a meal delivery and wasn't wearing any helmet or reflective clothing. Police temporarily closed Canton Road near Yamate following the incident. Kana Chu, TVB News.
Chief Secretary for Administration Matthew Jung says the city's youth hostel scheme is making progress. The 6 hostels under the plan will provide 2,800 living spaces for young people in the coming years. One in Taipo will supply 80 places when it's completed early next year. Another in Yunlong will provide an extra 680 places after its completion in 2021. The scheme, which was launched in 2011, supports NGOs with full capital costs to build these hostels. Each place will be rented at 60% of its market level.
Well, some 80 pieces of plastic rubbish were found in the stomach of a whale that died in Thailand today despite a 5-day effort to save it. Environmentalists say the case illustrates the growing threat of plastic to marine life in Thailand and around the world.
There's many problems as far as the garbage is concerned. Certain percentage of it comes from people buying something from the store. They get it wrapped in 3 carrier bags. They get a spoon and a straw thrown in. When they're finished with it, it doesn't always end up in the bin. I think another percentage of it comes in with the tides, and the tide can bring a lot of plastic pollution, for example, that is originally washed down the river or downstream into the sea, and then it kind of finds its way washed upon the beaches in Thailand.
Thai authorities plan to raise public awareness of the problem on World Oceans Day this week and call for reduced use of plastic. Thais use huge numbers of plastic bags, but authorities have launched campaigns to encourage people to use less plastic and use reusable bags. The United Nations says 8 million tons of plastic gets dumped into the ocean every year, killing marine life and entering the human food chain.
Thousands gathered in Rome yesterday to celebrate the so-called Government of Change on a symbolic date, Italian Republic Day. Italy's new right-wing coalition government was sworn in after a chaotic week and 90 days after the March 4th elections. It's headed by political novice Giuseppe Conte and supported by the anti-establishment Five Star movement. Saturday's rally had initially been organized as tensions flared between the country's president and the right-wing political parties he sidelined. The political upheaval has created Western Europe's first populist government and is dubbed the start of Italy's third republic. A vote of confidence on Conte's government will take place next week.
Desperate search for survivors in Kenya, where at least 3 people have died in a building collapse. This 5-story building came tumbling down at 1:30 in the morning in the capital of Nairobi. A rescue operation is underway. Heavy machinery is being used in the hope of finding survivors. Building collapses are common in Nairobi, where unscrupulous developers often bypass building regulations.
Israel released video today to prove it launched airstrikes against alleged terror targets in the Gaza Strip. The Israeli army claims its fighter jets attacked 3 Hamas military compounds in response to rocket fire. It said it struck a total of 15 targets. That includes weapons manufacturing and storage sites. It said the militants responded by firing another projectile that was intercepted. This comes as thousands of Palestinians attended a funeral of a man shot dead by Israeli troops the day before. Many medical workers present said the victim was their colleague. He was a volunteer paramedic who was treating the wounded during weeks of cross-border violence. And that's our news.
Thanks for joining us. Good night.